of subgroups. The question is it's not that they cease to have disabilities. I think that I don't have any statistics. We're going to look at some of the different categories of eligibility that are decreasing and some are increasing. So it isn't that we are not still under an obligation for what we call child find. That's another component of the IDEA law, which requires that school districts find students with disabilities. There has to be an effort to publicize in your community that special ed services are available. Right about now or in September, you will see in your school information that comes out, you will see some often in your community newspaper an awareness ad. If you have a child with a disability, call, and there'll be a contact number in your district. Every district has an obligation to provide notice that special ed services are available. How they do it, they just have to show us that they're making efforts. School districts have referral processes in place, which we'll talk a little bit about as we move on, because there has to be, even internally, a process that can demonstrate how do teachers get a student evaluated and eligible for special education. That's called child find. How do you find children who have impairments that need service? Numbers. We've done some calculations separating out our LEA stands for Local Education Agency or Local School District, just to help us keep track of some of the trends in population from public schools to charter or public school academies. So when we look at the totals of students in our local districts, we decrease from 37,000 to 35,000. Public school academy numbers, and this is just students with disabilities. 2010, close to 5,000, 4,781, 4% increase in 2011. Given that public school academies are increasing, we would expect to see, when we do our fall count, probably some additional increase in these numbers. We also have done a calculation of Detroit Public Schools removed from our numbers. Again, because we service the entire county, and we know that a lot of things and changes have been occurring within Detroit Public Schools, it's important for us to continue to be ready to assist and support. And some of the issues are more unique to the city programs versus out county. So in 2010, all the other school districts except Detroit, the count was 24,008, with a 3% decrease to 23,900. So all local districts, whether it's Detroit or any of the other districts, are losing students. But the number of out county has dropped, but you can see compared to Detroit, with our total that was about 40,000, so 23,000 more kids total out county than in the city of Detroit. It used to be fairly equal. Detroit Public Schools was pretty much equal to the rest of the county, but their population is decreasing at a little bit higher rate. Now, we have lots of different kinds of special ed students. Here are all the impairment areas. So first step when talking about children with disabilities, in Michigan, we are what is called a very categorical state. We identify children by very specific impairment areas, and we have program rules that specifically identify types of programs. Again, that is one fairly, we're probably lesser compared to other states. So when you look at this pie chart, obviously the green is the largest. That's severe learning disabilities. So of our total 40,000 students, 35% have severe learning disabilities. The next largest group would be speech and language impaired, and that's about 23%. Our cognitive impairment, and that includes all levels, severe, moderate, mild, about 12%. Our autism spectrum disorder, and we're going to see totals in each of these, or trends, but that category is running at about 8% of the total, and you'll see our chart which will show that on the increase, which is probably not a surprise to any of you. The other health impairment, in Michigan, we had one category up until 2002. That was physically and otherwise health impaired. The federal law separated those two categories out, and so in 1997, and so in Michigan, we went through a rules promulgation process and created two separate eligibility categories. One for other health impairment, and the other for physically impaired, which is a very tiny 1% of our population. The emotional impairment is about 6%. And of course, as you might expect, this is early childhood developmental delay. Smaller pot to choose from, so that is about 2% of our population. The early childhood developmental delay category is one that is primarily for children in the ages of birth, and it can go up to 8 if you are not able to identify clearly that the child's impairment is related to one of the others. So it helps us serve our little ones when they are, when it's really unclear yet as they are growing and developing, what are their primary areas of deficit going to be. So the traumatic brain injury is a very tiny number that is really barely represented on our chart, because there is this is a fairly new rule. Most of the students who have had a traumatic brain injury, and there's a specific definition of that eligibility, manifest in a variety of characteristics and often fit better in one of the other categories. The traumatic brain injury causes whatever the problems are. For example, if a child loses their cognition, their speech, they are more likely to be functioning like a student with a cognitive impairment. It was caused by the traumatic brain injury. It may be a brain stem injury, such as an accident that causes the student to become physically impaired, but perhaps cognition intact. So with traumatic brain injury, it depends on what the injury was and to what part of the body. Now let's look at some of those trend lines. Cognitive impairment has actually remained what we consider fairly steady over these 3 years. And even when we go back, there is some drop. One of the things that we talk a lot about in special education evaluation is a term called differential diagnosis. Any psychologists in the room? So what we think of, or what we expect, is when a team is conducting an evaluation, that they are sure to do differential diagnoses. Don't go in with a kind of preconceived idea. And look at all different areas so that when you ultimately land on a determination, you've considered a variety of other characteristics that might lead you to a different diagnosis. So again, back in the early years, our rules had 3 levels of cognition separated out. Severe cognitive impairment, which were typically students with IQs of 35 and below. And then we had a category for moderate level cognition, which was called trainable mentally impaired. Some of you remember that term. And those are typically, and I'm only using the IQ because there are many other components, IQ in the categories from about 35 to 55. And then mild level of cognition, or what we used to call educable mentally impaired, those were students whose IQs were in the range of 55 to about 70. In 2002, when MDE released a new set of rules, they collapsed all the cognition levels into one eligibility category. And that category says 2 standard deviations or more. So 2 standard deviations below the mean of intelligence is about IQ of 70. If it's greater, then it goes through the whole level of cognition. So for eligibility, it's a single term. Speech and language, you saw that it was about 22%, and that has remained fairly steady. And these are typically students who only have a speech and language impairment. So that's their primary impairment designated on their individual plan. Specific learning disability, we've had some decrease as well. Some of the reasons for that are we have in Michigan and probably across the country embarked on some very assertive, what we call response to intervention, or interventions at the very young years to prevent and improve deficits so that students are better able to remain in general education with little to no support or minimal support. So some of our numbers in the learning disability category are a relation to that, as well as a redefinition of the rule for LD. That occurred in 2006. Autism spectrum disorder, again, as I mentioned earlier, you're all